have your attention, please? Settle into your chair.
Yeah.
As I told you, I am perfectly pleased to relinquish the forum today so that we can hear the lecture and the analysis that Adam Schesch will make of the Chilean Revolution and of the more recent coup in Chile. As most of you know, Adam Schesch has been in or around Madison for a number of years. We knew him extremely well when there was a great collective movement against the war in Vietnam that emanated from this community and from this campus. And then in the fall of 1970, Adam and his wife went to Chile to do the research for their doctoral dissertations and remained there for the better part of 3 years until the Chilean coup of September of 1973, at which time they returned. Consequently, it is, I think, with one of those peculiarly rare insights that he comes to discuss this very important facet of Third World history and of Third World evolution with us. I should point out two things to you. That Adam tells me he will lecture roughly until the bell, that is until 3:15, and then, of course, we'll engage with you in whatever dialogue you wish to undertake at that particular time. Many of you have, I think, procured and read the article that Adam prepared for the Progressive magazine, so that should give you, at any rate, some basis not only for understanding what he will now say, but also for engaging in some kind of a dialogue. And if you're finished writing on the blackboard, I'll introduce you properly. If not, I'll go into my next lecture.
I'm a very blunt person sometimes. How many people actually have read the article? How many people have actually read the article? Okay, I want to be very honest with you then, because that means that I've partly watered down the lecture so that the lecture will be vaguely comprehensible to people who want to take notes on it. At the same time, I won't water it down all the way because some people did read the article, and therefore I'm not going to talk about some things. And if you want to, you can purchase at the end a copy, a reprint of the article outside. All the profits on it go to Chile on your way out. I don't know, it's probably not there now. It will be at the end of the hour. I'd like to say a word about this talk. Number one, it's a very tough problem, and I really don't feel that I completely understand the topic of this talk fully. Number two, it's a very delicate problem. I'm going to talk today about the question of the armed struggle in Chile. The theoretical question of the armed seizure of power, or the seizure of power during a revolution, using Chile as a case study. It's very delicate for a variety of reasons. I'll just mention a couple of the most important. First of all, sometimes you don't want to defend a point of view simply because if there's a struggle still going on, there are things that shouldn't be talked about. For example, I don't intend to try and prove to you, no matter how many questions I get, exactly how radical the Chilean left was. Number one, I don't know, but I have some idea, and I certainly don't intend to try and win the debating point. The other thing is that there's lots of questions that are matters of opinion. Oh, okay. Can you hear me without the microphone? Okay. You can get any 20 people, honest people, into the room who've all done research on a particular country, and some questions you can never exactly prove one way or the other in terms of certain things. So, what I want to do today is not prove whether or not the Chilean left was reformist or revolutionary, whether it was prepared or wasn't prepared. what I'd like to do specifically is talk about the problems of being prepared for the armed struggle. In particular, I'd like to focus a lot of attention on the limitations, the real conditions that impose themselves in a concrete situation that cannot be answered by any reference to a Bible, any pulling out of quotations. In fact, this was tried in Chile, and in practice, Bible quoting doesn't solve practical problems. You have to start from scratch and think up new solutions. So I basically am addressing this talk in a way to an audience of 500 people, most of whom call themselves radicals or leftists or progressives of one sort or another. And hopefully in about 15 years, the majority will still be in that category, and who have to begin to think about that kind of question, this kind of question here in the United States. And therefore, I almost want to look at Chile pedagogically, because there are many similarities between Chile and the United States. Some of the same kinds of questions will have to be asked here. And what I really want to do today is get people to start looking at these questions from a more practical, with a more practical eye. The name of this talk, or what I'm going to try and concentrate on, is how the question of the political, economic, and military overthrow of the political, economic, and military power of the Chilean elite was handled in practice by the left. I like to have a very brief preface, and I don't intend today to try and say I'm an academic or anything. Today is if you will, a partisan talk. So that's the way it should be. First of all, by way of preface, I would like to renounce or denounce the vast bulk of articles that are coming out in the non-bourgeois press in the United States after September 11th as to what went on in Chile. Basically, two kinds of articles appeared in the United States. One trying to justify the coup in terms of that Allende deserved to be overthrown. This is by the people who support U.S. imperialism. And secondly, articles basically written either by self-styled academic or radical or leftist writers, or by spokesmen for what I would call ultra-left fringe groups. There's been a basic post-mortem analysis that the People's Unity government betrayed the Chilean working class, and sometimes they even say that the Chilean ultra-left betrayed the Chilean working class through what they call it's either irresponsible or, in some articles, they're called pro-capitalist policies or reformist policies. Now, I'd like to say one very blunt thing about them. The bulk, I'm not saying every single one, of these articles have been written either by people who are not committed enough to commit themselves to a group, however they write as independents, or who are members of groups which have little or no experience in mass-based socialist movement building or in participation in an armed struggle. None of the articles that I've seen so far comes from a group which represents in any way any numerically significant quantity of American working class families. In addition, I might add, very rarely were the writers in Chile. Now, I think that in addition to the qualifications of these people, I think two other problems emerge. One is a general failure to evaluate Chile in the context of its historic competition. In other words, there's kind of a purist attitude of looking towards Chile, forgetting about what went on in other places. And two, and more importantly, to evaluate the Chilean left's successes or failures in the context of those factors, those realities, economic, social, military, etc., which existed and which put limitations on the possibilities of the preparations for a final conflict with the Chilean elite. Now, I have six sort of feelings, and I say feelings because I don't regard my conclusions as final yet, that about September 11th, which, you can look at after the talk, did I support my feelings or not? One, that the overthrow of the People's Unity government on September 11th is a setback, a serious setback, a major setback to the Chilean left, but not a crushing defeat, implying the need to basically start over from scratch in the struggle to top the elite. Secondly, that as a result of its policies, the armed struggle which will emerge because of the political strategy of the Chilean left will not be an elitist commando-style struggle, as it has been the common practice in Latin America in recent years, but in fact will be the first people's war in Latin America. That is the second feeling. The third feeling is that the 3 years of the People's Unity Government represented a major contribution in preparing the working class and the left within the working class for a successful people's war. Fourth, that in terms of what it's the quality of its preparation, that it's as a result of its own historic development, the historic limitations that it entered into and entered 1970 with, and as a result of mistakes that it did make that could have been partially avoided, the left did enter into the moment of confrontation on a percentage basis somewhat weaker than it might have. At the same time, I think it's a percentage basis. It would be the fifth observation. In other words, that no matter what had happened in terms of the left had overcome its own ideological weaknesses, its own analytic weaknesses, etc., that there wouldn't have been significantly different results. I think that in the best of conditions, had everything gone right, had the left been better, had all of its weaknesses, etc., been overcome, we would have had an unsuccessful coup degenerating immediately into a very bloody civil war, rather than a situation where the left is forced first to retire to total clandestinity and inactivity, military inactivity. And finally, I feel that the Chilean left, in terms of all the historic experiences, faced one of the most difficult set of circumstances that any left has ever had to face on a scale with it. Perhaps not the most difficult, but certainly not one of the best set of circumstances that a left has had to face. Now, very quickly, I'd like to say that it's important to compare Chile with its competition. And you don't have to note all of this down, I just want to make a point here. In terms of what are the basic categories of armed struggle that we've seen in the last 50 years? Well, let's start off with the successful socialist armed struggle. The USSR, 1917 to 21, China, 1927 to 49, Yugoslavia, 41 to 45, Czechoslovakia, 1948, Vietnam, 1945 to 54, Cuba, 1953 to 59. Now, those are the successful ones that are finished, so to speak. Then there's a successful one still going on. Laos, 1958 to the present. Guinea-Bissau, 1962 to the present. Vietnam, the NLF, 1960 to the present. I'm not trying to cover every single case that exists, obviously, but what I feel is significant. Now then, let's talk about the defeated socialist armed struggles for power, major cases. Germany, 1921 to 23. Spain, 36 to 39. Greece, 44 to 49. Philippines, 48 to 53. Malaya, 48 to 52. South Korea, 49 to 53. And all South American rural or urban conquista groups in the last decade. There's about a good 6 cases that are somewhat important. Now, then let's talk about the enemy here, if you will. Well, let's keep on going with it. Then there are a bunch of socialist struggles that were aborted before the armed struggle for power even started. And here I agree with Harvey Goldberg. France after 1944 and perhaps 1968. Italy after 1944. They never even got to that point. Then let's not even talk about socialism. There's only one real significant case of what we call a progressive nationalist failure. There's no real success. And that would be Ireland from 1921 to 23, in which the social revolutionary and progressive aspects of that Irish Revolution were betrayed in the 1921 agreement. They attempted to keep on and were crushed. Now, in terms of evaluating Chile, in terms of is it a complete defeat yet, we look at juntas, major cases of coup d'etats by counter-revolutionary governments who came to power very rapidly, who can say were consolidated. They had crushed the left, wiped out the opposition, the left had to start from scratch, name a few. Guatemala in 54, Brazil in 64, Greece 65, Indonesia 65, Dominican Republic 65. Now, I've left out, by the way, such cases as Algeria because the immediate I feel the immediate post-victory events produced non-social revolutionary governments. Now, again, let's look at Chile versus those cases of armed struggle. The bourgeoisie in Russia had been seriously weakened by World War I. The army was totally sapped and subverted and in miserable condition. The Chinese victory benefited from both the decadent nature of the Chinese elite, plus the political consequence of the Japanese invasion. Now, in terms of Yugoslavia and Vietnam, it's very clear again that the results of the foreign invasion, the ensuing social crises, and the internally weak bourgeoisie aided both these cases. Czechoslovakia, too, especially had favorable conditions after 1945. And then, I think it's very clear the lack of major foreign intervention and incompetence of the Cuban bourgeoisie aided the Cuban Revolution significantly. And actually, this is all unfair because I regard it as a very bad way of comparing Chile with its competition, because in fact the armed struggle is just beginning in Chile. A far better case comparison to be made by taking all of these cases and saying how well prepared was the left at the moment in which it had to enter into the armed struggle, how many years had it been at it. In that case, you'd have to look at how much of the population had it already organized, what was its organizational capacity. In other words, how much power had it inherently seized already in terms of social power before the first shot was fired, without costing the life of a single worker. And I might add that the total number of working people in Chile killed during the 3 years of the Allende government by the enemy, well, crudely speaking, don't add up to more than about 30 for the 3 years before September 11th. And that's one of the major ways of looking at penalties, if you will, of things. Well, now I'd like to briefly talk about the conditions that Chile faced. First of all, I would say that in terms of economics and politics and the military, Chile faced a far more difficult fight in most of these cases. Let's look at the things militarily. Chile is a very poor country to wage guerrilla war of any kind. The northern third of the country, for example, where the left has had one of its strongest political bases, are isolated mining towns. Very easy to cut off. They can starve to death in a matter of days. They don't even have water sources. Deep south is basically Arctic region, no good for fighting. The middle section of the country is very open, kind of almost our Great Plains kind of openness, in terms of little cover, not the jungles of Southeast Asia or the kinds of mountain areas that have been successfully used for guerrilla warfare, etc. Now, militarily, there's also the military as such. Chilean military has been, for a generation, one of the strongest in the third world. In fact, according to all sources, it's the second strongest military in Latin America after Cuba in terms of its country, proportion of the size of the population and so on. Stronger than Brazil. The best, most professional military after Cuba in Latin America. Best discipline, best training, etc., etc. So you're not talking about anything where you have, let's say, subversion of the Russian army in 1915, 16, and 17. You're dealing with an army which is a mess before you even start. Most of the cities of Chile are very poor for the Battle of Algiers, kind of a situation. You're basically talking about the capital, Santiago, and maybe one other city, Valparaiso. All the other cities are about as easy to control as Madison, Wisconsin, in terms of police deployment and possibilities of going underground and skipping across backyards and things. Okay, that was a very real factor. In addition, Chile has not had easy availability of weapons for 50 years, perhaps. There's very strong gun control laws. We forget that in most countries of the world, working people have no access at all to weaponry and never had in our time. I mean, the working class in the United States is probably infinitely better armed than most of the cases I've mentioned. Now let's talk about the social and economic situation. Chile had a situation where, while 2/3 of the population was living essentially in poverty conditions, it had a kind of economy that suggested for a long time possibilities of economic progress. In other words, it wasn't the kind of life and death situation that you faced in some of the cases, like China, where in effect you had no place to go but up. I mean, today that's absolutely true of Chile since September. But until right up to the Allende government, there was a real question in terms of the organization of an economy. By the way, mostly urban, a large industrial working class, mining and urban industries. 3/4 of the Chilean people live in large urban areas. Socially, Chile had a very strong, independent petty bourgeoisie. Merchants, small industrialists, small producers, independent professionals who did not work for salary, plus a very large white-collar working class, sections of which had been really infected by a very good campaign on the part of the Chilean elite, with lots of bourgeois ideas to the point where, just like a lot of our middle-class workers here say that they're not workers, I mean, they're not members of the working class. That's an ideological problem in terms of trying to explain class conflict in society. People somehow think themselves out of it. You have to convince them that they're in it. Now, politically, there was another problem. It's frankly very easy to rally people when the Nazis invade your country, or the Japanese, or anyone else. And a certain kind of gut thing, something's very clear in Algeria and so on. It's also very easy when you have a total dictatorship or a total exclusion of the population. No nothing. No Bill of Rights, no freedom of the press, no nothing. It's very clear what you're talking about. You can rally lots of people around very simple programs. Now, you're talking in Chile about something like here. In terms of you have a Congress, you have elections that are relatively uncorrupt. In Chile, you could run, in fact, there was more political freedom in Chile than here by far, because for a long time, there's been, except for, like an interlude, any party in Chile could run. And so you had many leftist parties running candidates for parliament, the trade union movement, which was openly left and political, without being crushed by the bourgeoisie. I mean, just recently, people of all kinds of groups in the U.S. are trying to do factory work now, and they keep on getting thrown out by laws on the books in the state, union constitutions and so on, that subversives can't be union officials and so on. We're talking about a country which has had anarchists, anarcho-syndicalists, then communists, and then socialists adding on, and then a whole slew of other smaller parties actively being trade union officials and so on. Now, the result of all of this was a situation where reform capitalism, that is an ideology, had a very great influence and was a very real force. In other words, it's sort of like here. Only now are we running out of the possibilities. I mean, we've had a New Deal and a Fair Deal and a New Deal and a New Deal in the Great Frontier in Camelot. Only now it's getting hard for them to think of a new deal that they can put up in 1976. Well, Chile had that same kind of a thing. There were part of their bourgeoisie saw education, social welfare, social security, minimum sanitary conditions, public housing, and so on as things that were necessary to modernize the society in order to have new kinds of markets and so on, and they campaigned at it. I'm just throwing it out. The left struggled in all of these conditions, and there were certain things that favored it, such as imperialism, which owned all the mineral rights, such as the fact that the elite still wanted to take the vast part of the profit pie, and people were living objectively in very poor circumstances. The whole working class and even sections of the petty bourgeoisie lived at miserable standards of living. 65% of the Chilean population, in our equivalent, families of 5 would live at $300 a month or less, 45% $200 a month or less, and a quarter of the Chilean population $100 a month or less. What they can afford to buy. Well, a quarter of Chilean families have $100 a month if they were living in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm trying to rather than give you a clue. Okay. Now the left had fought a long battle within the context I've described, and by 1970 it had reached a condition which is far advanced in most countries of the world. For example, it had been electing In the parliamentary system, about 1/3 of the senators and congressmen, presidential candidates, have gotten 1/3 or more of the vote in several elections. Trade union movement was 2/3 communist and socialist. Well, in terms of the indirect elections they had, it was almost completely communist and socialist. In terms of who people were really supporting, 2/3 Marxist trade union movement, which was able to just throw into the garbage can the U.S.-sponsored American Institute of Free Labor Development. They had made some major gains for the Chilean working class in terms of social conditions. I'll give you one example of things that were already on the books as a result of labor struggles, but not always implemented. The principle of an annual readjustment of all wages and salaries due to inflation was on the books by the time Allende became president through working class party struggle. Now, boy, look at our 9.5% last year, and don't we wish we had some dinky reformist law like that on the books? So this was a left which had made some major achievements. Now, when 1970 came, summing all of this up, one of the real problems facing the left was 40 years of struggle within a certain kind of context. In other words, one of the first limitations that we found was the unreality of the question of armed struggle in a very real way. Even during the first year, through the first year and a half almost of the UP, there was a general state of euphoria. There was less violence in any definition of the word in terms of simple crime to political murder to anything than the United States of America. Far less. In terms of the general euphoria of it, during the first few months, even the right-wing press, they either said nothing or modest, praised in mild terms some of the more obvious achievements, like a quart of milk a day for all children program. There was a certain thing about Chile being the Swiss and England of Latin America. They hadn't had the last coup in 1931. And then this whole long history of open struggle. Now, basically, by 1970, the left could realistically, or look at in a real way, in other words, they weren't just, deceiving themselves about the idea of having several years in which to implement the guts of a transitional program. Our article discusses that in economic terms and so on. The basic thing from the military question in the transitional program was to allow you to subvert the economic and political and military institutional power of the bourgeoisie, to drastically weaken it before you reach that point in which you have the armed struggle. So therefore, the question became the immediate question of implementing the transitional program. Now, in 1970, there was only one group who was referring openly to the question of armed struggle, and that was MIR. But at that time, I don't know how to say it. That would be another half-hour discussion, prove or not prove. But they were basically, it was something that was unreal given the general conditions. The UP was nationalizing copper without a whimper. Right-wing congressmen are voting for the nationalization bill. Land agrarian reform. 30% of land is changing hands in the first 2 years. 30% of all Chile farmland is changing hands, and not more than 8 or 9 or 10 peasants died, and not more than 2 or 3 landlords died during that entire changeover. It was these kind of spectacular advances, and the army was completely aloof. Now, the left here on the question of armed struggle was divided crudely in terms of analyzing what conditions existed, what were your possibilities, and what was going to produce, or how was the moment of armed struggle going to come about. Let me run through some of the basic differences. One, there was a difference of conception of the period 1970 to 76, Allende's presidential term. The basic parties of the UP felt they were going to get through the period, or almost through the period, possibly not getting through. It was so vague and distant people didn't even think about it. And they thought they could get a great deal done. The very small minority position, almost of individuals in the UP, and Mir felt they wouldn't get through and would get very little done, much less, in fact, than they concretely did. At the time, Mir basically said they would get almost no agrarian reform, that would never carry out the nationalization, and a whole bunch of other things that the UP did do, and this is part of the reason why Mir's position never did win over a substantial majority of the thinking left, because in fact they had completely underestimated the thing, what was possible utilizing this bourgeois state. The analysis, a second analysis, I'm calling it to differentiate here, within Chile. One basically Mir said that the confrontation was inevitable. In the end, the basic feeling of Mir was not that there was a force within the UP that was going to sell out, was totally corrupted, totally reformist, but rather that by their actions they were preventing the development of the people's power, if you will, to resist the bourgeoisie. Then there was a group, mainly ultras within the UP, who were the most ultra of all, in fact, partly because they had no party responsibility. They didn't speak for any party. They kind of spoke for themselves. Mir had to take responsible positions and defend them on forum after forum, which felt that there was a strong possibility that there would be no confrontation. It put most of its emphasis in terms of questions of struggle and so on struggling to prevent the reformist wing of the UP, as they call it, from making a deal with the Christian Democrats and the constitutionalists or apolitical or non-reactionary military, and permanently blocking the road to socialism, in other words, the formation of state capitalism. There was one group which continued this line literally up until the June 29th attempted coup of 1973. That the main enemy, the main problem was to prevent a reformist sellout. I mean, this particular group has been severely decimated by virtue of the fact that it started its own military preparations on June 29th because it said this couldn't happen. And in fact, we've heard that a couple of people are still saying that, somehow the coup was this whole cahoots package, of selloutism. In other words, this was all planned kind of by Allende, and they sort of unfortunately got shot in a way. Okay, the question of moving in the direction of an open economic war and total conflict, there was a division between, again, principally Mir and in practice the Socialist and Communist Party leadership. I'm going to leave out there are variations on this within smaller parties. I'm leaving all this out today. As to how fast this thing was going to happen. In one sense, Mir, by virtue of the fact that it totally underestimated the process, kind of left itself out. I mean, people, it was always saying the conflict's kind of coming next month. The conflict's coming next month, 3 to 3 years. On the other hand, it was very clear that the conflict, the mainline leadership of the traditional parties of the People's Unity government was a long period in the future. And at the beginning, their own conception of it really coming in concrete terms was very vague. That's a criticism. In other words, their marches in 1 week. They kind of saw lots and lots of possibilities for maneuver. Now, this was all connected to the role of the bourgeois state and the question of dual power. Now, these are two fundamental questions where there's a big split actually in life. The bulk of the Unidad Popular, and I think it's fair to say the entire Unidad Popular, because not a single party ever openly wrote to the UK on this, felt that the acquisition of the presidency was a major weapon in the hands of the working class. And this was thought to be in military terms too. The access it gave you to the possibilities of manipulation within, of softening up the armed forces, of winning over executives of the officers' staff. The control it gave you over such things as investigation of the National FBI of Chile, which was basically leftist in sympathy from a long time back and headed up by leftists all the way through. The control it gave you over the Carboneros, a group which was very open to influence by the Unidad Popular because all the police of Chile lived in working class neighborhoods. And basically, large chunks of them were even the lower-ranking officers were workers and peasants in background. The mere position was that basically the access to the bourgeois state apparatus gave you almost nothing. And they basically regarded the concern with the utilization of this as actually impeding both the subversion of the armed forces and the independent preparation of the working class. Now, here, this is tied to a second question, the question of dual power, as it's commonly phrased. Dual power is basically dual organized social power. The question of dual power is very simple. I'll give you my summary of it, so you should know. There's so many definitions of a lot of these phrases, but if you don't know the speaker's definition, you can't really see whether his argument is valid or not. The dual power question is that there's a whole bunch of social institutions, Congress, the state bureaucracy, the armed forces, as well as non-state institutions such as trade unions, social clubs, groups, the Freemasonry, the churches, and so on, in a bourgeois society. That in general these are managed by the elite. That as you move to the point of rupture, after you've exhausted all the possibilities inherent within this bourgeois system, you have to have new kinds of organizations set up or create them, so that you organize the people in new organizational forms that are free from the control of the bourgeoisie. So that at a certain point, some of these organizations at least can become the basis, the nucleus of the military organization, the independent military organizations of the working class. Now, the dual power and the role of the bourgeoisie concept got sort of complicated in Chile because dual power was also concerned with the need to have new and totally independent people's organizations in order to push or not push the bourgeois state into doing things for the people. Now, any of you have seen in Complemento, very clearly the idea comes through there that the independent poblador organizations are the only reason why any housing or social service benefits came from the People's Unity government. In other words, that the idea that almost nothing could be done with the bourgeois state said in effect that the only way to get any concrete benefits, even from the very beginning, is by having your own struggle organizations in which you treat the bourgeoisie, even though it's President Salvador Allende, as a kind of an enemy. You goad it and prod it and browbeat it and harass it into action. You speed it up, at least. The Unidad Popular, mostly through the 3 years, and again, these are all just generalizations, felt that there was a lot that could be done with the People's Unity government, and that, in a sense, popular organization should be seen as a supplement. In other words, a kind of team in which you have the government apparatus, that part of it controlled by the left. They're not talking about the court system, and they're not talking about Congress. The government apparatus, that part managed by the left, and the mass organizations, particularly the trade union movement, managed by the left, joined together in terms of the working class parties, whose base and leadership and cadre are from the working class, in a giant kind of two-sided assault on Chile's bourgeois economy and social and political structure. That in fact, particularly the Communist Party placed heavy emphasis on the utility, the strategic and fundamental utility of having the presidency. The mass organizations were kind of a supplement. Now, in that sense, there was a great convergence of problems. If they saw the struggle as several years off, if they saw, let's say, they overestimated the possibilities of this bourgeois state, then obviously there's the result of that is to, let's say, not put enough emphasis on the construction of these organizations, and not develop them as fully as they could be. Now, I should say that there's two stages in all of this thing. There's the first year and a half and the second year and a half. And what happened after the first year and a half, if you will, is Mears' analysis began to catch up to reality, and at the same time, the dominant view in the UP basically changed, without a single exception, under the impact of the beginnings of the economic warfare of the bourgeoisie and the open attempts of terrorists and whatnot subversion in Chile by the bourgeoisie, made fundamental changes in such things as how far distant the armed struggle would be. Now, the last division or question was in the military question. Now, I'm going to basically refer you to three things that if you're interested in this, particularly if you're thinking about the United States, I think there are three books or things you want to look up. One is a book by a person anonymously named A. Newberg. Just look up the word armed insurrection as a book title. I'll explain these things afterwards. Secondly, there's a book by a man named Mutbach, who's a Defense Department consultant, who wrote a book called Coup d'etat, and that's what the Chilean coup looked like. It's also a paperback, very worthwhile reading. And the third is to somehow find a fairly objective or scientific account of the Czechoslovakian coup or armed insurrection of 1948. With those three things in hand, you can begin to deal with the military question in the Chilean armed forces. Finally, you actually should go and get some kind of book that talks about Latin American military that has a chapter on the Chilean armed forces. The military question was kind of dependent on everything I've laid out before. Until mid-1972, no one said anything about the armed struggle that can be called serious. Literally. I mean, things about, let's go on the workers who form the Red Militia without any explanation of why, or things like that, to my mind are nonsense. I mean, you have to explain exactly how. In other words, if someone talks about armed struggle, they have to explain. First of all, they have to show that they understand the realities. Then they have to show how they're going to deal with those realities in a strategy that allows them to prepare, without being pressed beforehand, for the moment in which there'll be an armed confrontation. Now, before 1972, there was no debate in any coherent way, shape, or form on the question. Now, in 1972, and the first part of 1973, two different conceptions of the armed struggle emerged, and they depend very concretely on the previous. There were two variables here: the regular military and the people. Let's take them. Start. Oh dear. How many people have to leave the next class? Oh dear. Okay, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I get carried away. I'm going to go through these two positions and sum it up, so the people who have to leave at least have the result, general picture. And then, with your permission, I'll go on. I'll go back in some detail. Now, so first I'm going to sum up. There's going to be kind of a pause, and then I'll go back in some detail. The basic thing of the armed forces was the conception of the possibilities of the subversion of the armed forces, and here I include the police. Mir basically felt that literally nothing could be done with the armed forces in any way except for the open calls for the subversion, for the breaking of ranks of the soldiers at the base and non-commissioned officers. Their image was taken from this book, Armed Insurrection, by Newberg, and I refer you to it. What they felt was that the armed forces would remain intact, controlled by a professional and military, that nothing could be done. And that basically you were going to have a moment in which the right would attempt to make a coup. And unless you had developed a very strong armed power by the people, in other words, unless, in effect, the people were at least vaguely in the same level of capacity, or at least within the same range or realm in terms of their weaponry, their training organizations, etc., the left would be crushed. Within the people's unity government, there were variations again, and I'm being very gross here,
But I think that the most clear-cut alternative to this was a series of articles published by the Communist Party in February of 1973. These articles took the model of the armed insurrection of Czechoslovakia in 1948. They were published on the 25th anniversary, and what makes me feel that they were very serious indeed is that this was just before the March election campaign, when the right was accusing the left of planning such a thing. Therefore, it was very dangerous to publish this kind of thing in terms of the election. They went ahead and did it anyway, and I regarded it as they were basically tipping off the mass base of the Communist Party that, number one, there was going to be an armed struggle coming, and number two, the way they felt it should be done. The way they felt it should be done was the following: to work through their control of the state apparatus, that the Chilean left would be able to effect some kind of a rupture in the Chilean armed forces, in which a significant section, at the moment of confrontation, would fall away. In fact, including officers, non-commissioned officers, and sections of the conscripts. At the same time, this falling away would be joined to a limited kind of militia that would obviously have to be constructed beforehand. In particular, for example, they referred to the Czechoslovakian unity of the police units under the command of a leftist infiltrated police, top of the police force, with armed squads of workers organized in the factories in a week of armed demonstrations that led to the seizing of power by the left in Czechoslovakia. Now, they wrote two editorials and one article describing how it was done. And the point I'd like to make here is the article, as far as my limited knowledge of Czechoslovakia, didn't have too much to do with the reality of Czechoslovakia. In other words, they had two things. They had found the only case that corresponded in any sense of the word to Chile, and two, they had had enough creative imagination to not try and simply do a copycat with it, to describe it in terms in which you basically felt you were reading about Chile rather than Czechoslovakia. I had a friend send me down a descriptive article on Czechoslovakia so I could figure out, how close they were. Well, I'm going to go on with a pause. That is the essence in terms of the two approaches. I can't obviously describe in the whole development ring what happened. Before I do, I'd like to ask you to hold on for a second. 30 seconds. There are going to be people who are going to be both standing on the way out and who are going to, as we continue on, start passing around the can. I'm making an appeal today, not for nickels and dimes, but for dollars or higher. The money is going to be used to be sent straight down to Chile. Not exactly straight, but to go inside Chile to help support the resistance movement that's developing there. I really hope, in the spirit of international solidarity, that people will make substantial contributions. Also, maybe if you want to examine it, there's almost a human quality of feeling human yourself when you have to kind of shout. This is what the first point where I think it's worth in terms of a brief presentation, going into the question of the differences within the non-mere military analysis. Now, within the UP, there were only 3 parties, which substantially, there were 6 parties in the UP, gave any indications of opposition on the question of on the military. The communists were the most vocal. And I think one of the things I've indicated today, in fact, is, well, perhaps the fact that there were only 2 parties that you can even discover a clear-cut position. I think part of it's due to the fact that the parties know better than to publish in the newspaper what there's an answer to the military question. But also, I think it's also partly true that I feel that they didn't really take this question seriously until we were getting into the actual period just before the armed confrontation. In other words, until after, particularly the Paro of 1972. In other words, one of the fundamental valid criticisms of the Chilean left is not that they didn't want the armed struggle, nor did they feel they could get away without one, but that they didn't realize that you have to begin to prepare for the armed struggle at a moment when the thing seems indeed very remote. That they kind of didn't take seriously the question until it was glaringly obvious to even a foreigner like myself that this question ought to be seriously discussed. Now, they were Chileans, and they should have had it in a real sense. But anyway, the third position, if you will, that emerged was in contradiction to the communist practice rather than their, or the communist, what was behind the formal image of Czechoslovakia they gave. What really did happen is that the party itself drifted into a great overestimation of the real large possibilities of splits within the armed forces. In particular, they, and to some degree everyone else, forgot that the armed forces, which are so frequently set aside as a kind of neutral group, almost without class, do have both a class composition. In terms of the origins of every single person who's in the armed forces, they came from a family. In other words, they weren't born in an armed forces barrack. They came from a family. They have brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and cousins and so on out there. And two, that within the armed forces, there's a class structure, if you will, in terms of privilege, in terms of power, in terms of living standards, and so on. And the party, in terms of its faith in the real inherent possibilities of the state structure that it controls and of the ideology that goes with the state structure, gradually it was clear that there was at least a debate going on inside the UP over the relative necessity of the strength or the amount of effort that you were going to give to the workers' organizations. In other words, there wasn't disagreement that you had to split the armed forces. Well, what was, and that it was possible, but there was disagreement somehow, and I must say, I'm indicating here that you can get very few real clear indications of this, as to, how much we could rely on it. And I think September 11th answered a lot of these kind of hidden debates or hidden fights. Now, what were the technical realities in terms of the military question, as it appears to me afterwards? In other words, what's the reality of, for example, forming the Red Army independent of the armed forces? To me, can't involve it. The technical realities that you're working with in this case are the following. Number one, the military, at best, is apolitical professionalist, and at worst, is conservative when Allende becomes president. The technical reality changes in terms of, here we put a brownie point on the side of the Unidad Popular analysis, in the sense that the left was successfully able to form within the armed forces, within the army and the police, a genuine progressive wing who wanted to see the People's Unity Government program implemented. That doesn't mean they wanted to communist society, they wanted to see it implemented. In fact, there are two Air Force generals being tried for high treason, namely they supported the Allende government, and they had to, the coup depended upon eliminating General Prax and two other generals from the army. In other words, they did not even try to launch the coup. There's been an interview with the Junta about their planning for the coup. And it was clear that one of the preconditions for the coup was the elimination of the Praxian sector of the army, which included 5 generals. Including Prax, the commander-in-chief of the army, Pickering, who's the head of all of the service academies of Chile, and Sepulveda, who was the commander-in-chief of the entire military garrison of Santiago province. Now, this is created as a result of the Union of the Foreign Practice. To give you one example, General Pinochet of the Air Force is being tried by high treason, was a simple constitutionalist with good intentions, but the government brought him in because he was a logistics expert to help handle the government's distribution program. And within 6 months, this man had changed over fundamentally. He had really come to see what he hadn't been a writer, I'm saying. He'd been an apolitical kind of wishy-washy, if you will. He had really come to believe in the social program of the People's Unity Government after trying to implement distribution. Now, the reality in terms of arming the people, to get back to that, was that there was a military monopoly in Chile in 1970. Very few people had anything bigger than slingshot. You had to have a special permit, you had to have a hunting line. Now, the military, as I said, was very well trained, second best in Latin America, had its own military intelligence system, and the possibilities of landing enormous cargo ships, or flying in 50 airplanes or something like that, openly arming the workers in any way, shape, or form, setting up open guerrilla training camps, or any kind of thing like that, during the first 2.5 years or 3 years, was virtually impossible because of one reality condition. It would have immediately consolidated on the side of a right-wing coup d'etat all of the apolitical, constitutionalist, or professionalist officers who for 2.5 years were successfully stage-managed or managed by the government in such a way that the coup could not happen until 1973. In other words, one of the conditions that kept the loyalists loyal to the government during the 3 years was the government abiding by certain principles of the armed forces, the defender of the nation, of the armed forces as having monopoly of power, of respecting the military institutions of Chile, and so on. It was this very attention, for example, Allende he must have gone to 55 military reviews if he went to one. I mean, we got sick and tired of seeing the socialist minister of defense showing up at every goddamn non-commissioned officer's graduation exercise for 3 years, etc. But all of this had a very crucial role. It created an atmosphere, number one, in which the right wing, which was operating from 1970 on, could not pull off the coup until after 3 years. Two, it created a progressive sector within the armed forces officer corps. So the arming of the people had to proceed clandestinely, extremely clandestinely at the beginning, and somewhat more openly as we got into 1973. So in fact, one of the realities was the inability to form a true Red Army before a moment of confrontation. In fact, one of the realities was the absolute necessity to have a split in the armed forces in order to permit the arming of the people. Because one of the things you would do would bring over arms from the loyalist sector into the arming of the people. Now, this is clear in one of the interviews in terms of one of the charges they've got against the generals that they're trying and so on, is that they were planning, that they have proof that they were planning to give arms to the workers, arms factories and so on, break military discipline. In terms of the armed forces, there was a question of subversion of the armed forces from below. Now here, on balance again, we run into the same factor as the jealous monopoly of arms in terms of the armed forces. The professionalism was a double-edged sword. It both allowed you to struggle against the right within the armed forces to play upon professionalism in terms of industrializing the country, professionalism in terms of national defense against imperialism, if you will. But also professionalism in terms of no outside political interference with the base of the armed forces. Now, one of the things you have here is the reality of you can't have your cake and eat it too in certain kinds of situations. In other words, either you're neutralizing a certain part of the officer corps, and remember that the people who wanted the coup wanted it as early as September 4th, 1970, when Allende won the elections, continued right on up to his inauguration. The day we arrived, November 1st, 1970, and there are at least a good dozen coup attempts during the 3 years, of which, before the final one, there were 2 serious attempts and 9 others. Okay. The reality also was the fact that from the other side of the coin, doing all of this thing meant and could mean and did mean in practice coming to have to over-depend upon the loyalties of people who were only converted ideologically, who were only converted emotionally. I'd like to make one which is a political point. Class interest corresponds to the reality of the economic and social situation of the person. In other words, a person who comes from a professional background, a petty bourgeois student at this university, is not dependable until he gets into a position where he's trapped in the system, or she is trapped in the system. Because there is that escape route. And we all know about the 4-year radical. Well, the problem with the progressive officers was that they, even if they were totally honest and totally sincere in their beliefs, were subject to class pressures. Their families, for example, their wives, who would put pressure on them. In terms of what, particularly in terms of an old established belief like Chile, the near elite, sons going to the armed forces, what the hell are you supporting the governor of the Francones for? And these people go to the same parties, the same dinners, the same everything, their brothers, and so on. In addition, there's that factor of they get bothered or disturbed, and they don't have the ideological capacity to explain it fully to themselves when the members of